The night Seraphine Ashmore vanished, the Silver Crest Pack lost the only thing standing between their king and his own ruin. And he was too proud to know it. She didn't run because she was weak. She ran because she saw what was coming, and no one would listen. What happens when the woman a king dismissed as fragile becomes the force that decides whether his world survives? Stay with me until the end, and drop your city in the comments, because this story was made for people who know what it costs to walk away from someone who never deserved you. The torch brackets along the corridor to the Alpha King's private council chamber burned lower than usual that night, their flames guttering in the draft that pushed through the cracked mortar of the old stone walls. It was the kind of cold that didn't come from weather. It came from something wrong in the air, some pressure building behind the walls of a place where too many lies had been told for too many years. Seraphine stood outside the chamber door with her back flat against the stone and her hand pressed over her mouth. Inside, 3 voices. She recognized all of them. Lord Casimir Vorn, the king's chief advisor, whose soft hands had never held a sword, but whose mouth had built more traps than any blade. Elder Rowan Tetch, the oldest council member, who had served 4 kings before Kaelin and who smiled like a grandfather and calculated like a butcher. And the third voice, the one that made the bile rise in her throat. Lord Aldrich Morn, Kaelin's closest friend since boyhood, the man who had stood beside them at their mating ceremony and pressed his palm to Kaelin's shoulder and said, "She's the best thing that ever happened to you, brother." That same voice now said, "The Luna's influence over the border packs has grown too substantial. The Ashvale delegation defers to her. The Crestfall elders bring their disputes to her before they bring them to the throne. This is not a Luna's function. This is a queen consolidating power." Seraphine didn't move. Her breath came slow and controlled, the breathing she had learned during her years of training with the pack's boundary scouts, a technique for staying still in the dark while something dangerous moved nearby. "Kaelin won't hear it," Rowan Tetch said. "He thinks her diplomatic work strengthens the crown." "It strengthens her position," Casimir said. "There is a difference. A king who cannot see that difference is a king whose throne is already eroding beneath him." A pause. The sound of liquid being poured. "What are you proposing?" Aldrich asked. "Not what do you mean? Not I don't follow. What are you proposing?" Like a man who had already accepted the destination and was only asking about the route. Seraphine's hand dropped from her mouth. She pressed her palm flat against the stone at her side. "Nothing violent," Casimir said, and the smoothness of his voice, the way he said nothing violent the same way a man might say nothing expensive, made her stomach clench hard. "The Luna is with child. Early yet. If the right questions were planted at the right time, if the right witnesses saw the right things, the Alpha King is a proud man. Pride is the easiest lever in the world. You'd have him cast her out." Aldrich's voice was even. No outrage, no hesitation. "I'd have him choose to cast her out, without ever knowing he was guided to the choice. A king who exiles his own Luna on the grounds of treachery is a king whose counsel fills the vacuum she leaves behind. The border packs return to the throne's direct authority. The diplomatic channels she built revert to intermediaries we control." Casimir paused. "And there is no blood, no scandal, only a faithless Luna who ran rather than face her mate's judgment." The silence that followed lasted long enough that Seraphine counted 7 of her own heartbeats. Then Aldrich Morn said, "How long will it take to set up?" She was already moving. She walked, not ran. Walking was invisible. Running was a flag. Back through the corridor, around the east wing turn, through the servants' passage that cut behind the kitchens, and into the small storage room at the far end of the lower hall that she had identified 3 months ago as the one room in the entire keep that had no sightlines from any window or doorway. She had identified it 3 months ago because 3 months ago she had begun to notice small things. A message arriving in the wrong order. A border elder's tone shifting when she walked into a room. Kaelin's jaw tightening in a way it hadn't tightened before when she mentioned a diplomatic success. She had told herself she was imagining it. She stood in the dark storage room with the smell of old linen and dried herbs around her, and she pressed both hands flat against her abdomen, and she thought very clearly and without panic, "I have until morning." The pregnancy was 8 weeks along. She had not yet told Kaelin. She had been waiting for the right moment, for the nausea to ease, for something she couldn't quite name, some tension in the keep that she had been trying to read and could now read perfectly clearly. There would never have been a right moment. The right moment had been strangled before she found it. She thought about walking to Kaelin's chambers right now. She thought about what she would say. "My king, I overheard your counsel. Your closest advisor and your oldest friend are planning to destroy me. Your childhood companion, who stood at your side when you bound your life to mine, is already choosing which route to take." She thought about the look on Kaelin's face. Not rage. She could have worked with rage. She thought about the moment of hesitation. The fraction of a second where his pride would brush against his trust, and where, if Casimir and Morn had already begun to plant their seeds, the hesitation would bloom into doubt before she could uproot it. She knew that face. She had been watching it change for months. A man who already half believes a lie will hear a truth as confirmation of his doubt. She had one advantage, and it was thin as a blade and just as dangerous to hold. They didn't know she had heard them, which meant they hadn't started yet, which meant the false witnesses hadn't been positioned, the forged evidence hadn't been placed, the rumors hadn't been seated in the right ears, which meant if she moved now, she moved before the trap was built. The child in her was the only variable. If she stayed, the pregnancy would eventually show, and Casimir would use it. The timing, the questions about the father, all of it deployed at precisely the moment it would do the most damage. If she left before the trap was set, she became the Luna who ran, rather than the Luna who was publicly destroyed. One of those outcomes left her breathing. Only one of those outcomes left the child breathing. She stood in that dark room for 4 minutes. She counted them. Then she stopped feeling like a woman standing at the edge of a cliff and started feeling like a woman measuring the distance to the other side. She moved. She took nothing that would be missed immediately. Her personal seal, which was too dangerous to leave behind because the right forger could use it. A leather satchel with traveling medicines she had assembled herself over the past year under the pretense of preparedness for pack emergencies. She had told Kaelin once she kept emergency kits in various locations throughout the keep, and he had smiled and called her thorough and not thought about it again. 3 changes of clothing, all plain. The small iron dagger she kept strapped beneath the left side of her vanity table, which she had told no one about, which she had oiled and sharpened every 2 weeks since the first month she arrived in the keep, not from fear but from the conviction that a woman who has no weapon is a woman who has only her words, and words are not always enough. She wrote no letter. She left no explanation. She understood that any word she left behind would be read by someone other than Kaelin first, and read through whatever lens Casimir's careful planning would have already installed in the household's interpretation of events. Silence was not betrayal. Silence was the only message they couldn't rewrite. She slipped out through the lower kitchen gate before the first bell, into the cold air that smelled like pine resin and river mud and the particular darkness of a mountain night in Silvercrest territory, and she walked north along the tree line where the border sentries didn't post because the cliff face on the northern approach made it a route nobody sane would take. Seraphine Ashmore took the route nobody sane would take, and she did not look back at the keep lights, because she already knew what was back there, and she needed to be entirely present for what was ahead. Tussie. 3 days later, Kaelin Draven sat in the same council chamber with the same 3 men and learned that his Luna had fled. The details were presented carefully. A maidservant who had seen Seraphine moving through the lower hall late at night. A missing seal. The empty chambers. An unnamed border scout who claimed secondhand to have heard the Luna speaking with a messenger from the Ashvale delegation 3 days prior. A meeting that had never been reported to the throne. None of it was enough. Any one of those facts, standing alone, was meaningless. Together, shaped by the right voice in the right order, they became a story. Casimir told the story quietly, with what appeared to be reluctance. Kaelin sat at the head of the table with his hands resting flat on the wood and his face completely still, which was how he looked when something was dismantling something inside him that he didn't yet have language for. "She took her seal," he said. "Yes, my king." "Nothing else of value? No treasury access? No pact documents?" "No. A woman building a new power base doesn't leave without funds or documentation." His voice was level. the voice of a man following a thread. Casimir spread his hands. A frightened woman doesn't always think strategically. Seraphine, Kalen said her name once, flatly, like he was testing its weight, is not a frightened woman. There was a pause. The border territories, Aldrich said, from the seat to Kalen's right, his voice carrying the careful gentleness of a friend managing a wound. She had relationships there that were entirely hers. If she's gone to... She didn't betray me. Kalen said it quietly. Not with certainty. He was too smart for certainty, and somewhere under the layer of his pride, the thread he'd been pulling was starting to unravel something he couldn't bear to look at directly. He said it like a man saying the words in order to hear whether they sounded true. They sounded true. But she was gone, and she had left nothing. And in the silence that she'd left behind, the men who had shaped themselves into the corners of his trust began to speak, and what they said was careful and sorrowful and built exactly the way a foundation is built, stone by stone, each piece resting on the last, until the whole structure feels inevitable. An hour later, Kalen Draven stood at the window of his private chamber looking out over the Silver Crest Valley, and he felt the precise texture of betrayal, not because the evidence demanded it, but because he was a proud man, and pride, in the end, finds the interpretation that hurts it the least. He told himself she had run because she was guilty. He told himself it slowly, and with great pain, because the pain made it feel real. He let her go. Down. The passage through the northern cliffs took Seraphine 11 days. On the second day, she slipped on wet rock and opened her palm on a sharp edge, and she bound the wound with the strip of cloth she'd pre-cut for exactly this kind of situation, and she kept moving. On the fifth day, she lost the narrow trail in the dark and spent 4 hours crouched under a rock overhang in driving rain, pressing her back against the stone with her hand over her belly and her knees drawn up and her mind working through route calculations with the systematic focus of someone who cannot afford to spend any of her mental energy on emotion right now and knows it. On the 8th day, she crossed out of Silvercrest territory. The air changed, subtly, the way pack-bounded territory always changed at its edges, a loosening of the invisible pressure that a pack's collective presence laid over the land it claimed. She had crossed borders before as Luna. She had never crossed one alone, at night, on foot, with no documentation and a secret growing inside her that would become visible in another few months. She kept moving. The land beyond Silvercrest's northern border was technically unclaimed, a buffer zone that the neighboring territories had never formalized because the terrain was too difficult and the soil too poor to make formalization worth the political cost. For the past decade, the people who lived here had been a mix of scattered human settlements and small, unaffiliated wolf families who owed allegiance to no pack and survived by being useful to everyone and beholden to no one. Seraphine had read every report from this region that had passed through Silvercrest's archives. She had noted in those reports 2 things that most of the council had apparently considered unimportant. The region had no formal authority, which meant it had no formal enemies, and its inhabitants had been surviving without pack support for long enough that they had developed a specific kind of practical competence, a community built around function rather than hierarchy. She had marked it 3 months ago as the place she would go if she ever needed to disappear. She did not think of this as having planned for abandonment. She thought of it as what it was, a woman paying attention to her circumstances and declining to be entirely at their mercy. The first settlement she reached was a small mixed community of roughly 40 people on the south bank of a river that had no name on any official map, but which the locals called the Grey Wash for the color of its current in the spring melt. She arrived mud-covered and exhausted, and with her right hand wrapped in cloth that had soaked through twice and been rewrapped. A woman met her at the edge of the settlement, older, mid-60s, with the kind of compact, deliberate physicality that came from decades of hard work rather than training. She looked at Seraphine for a long moment, specifically at her feet, her hands, the set of her shoulders. "You're Wolf," the woman said. "Yes." "You're alone." "Yes." "How far have you traveled?" 11 days north." The woman's eyes moved to Seraphine's wrapped hand, then up to her face, and then, with the particular perceptiveness of someone who had seen enough of the world to read its small signs, to the way Seraphine was standing, one hand loose at her side, one hand, almost without awareness, resting very slightly against her lower abdomen. "Come inside," the woman said. "I'll put water on." Her name was Mara. She was the closest thing the graywash community had to a leader, which meant she was the person everyone came to with disputes and resource questions and medical emergencies, and which meant she had learned over 20 years to solve problems with the materials actually available rather than the materials she wished she had. She set bread and dried meat in front of Seraphine without asking, and she poured water heated over the fire and cleaned and rewrapped the hand wound without commentary, and she sat down across the table and waited. "I'm not returning where I came from," Seraphine said. "Didn't ask you to." "I'm going to need shelter. I can work." "What work can you do?" Seraphine looked at her. "I can read maps and write treaty language. I can plan supply routes. I can negotiate between parties who don't trust each other because I know what each of them actually wants when they say something different. I can treat wounds and diagnose illness, and I can train fighters, although I'd need to eat properly for several months before I'd be useful for that last one." She paused. "I can also do whatever physical labor is immediately necessary. I'm not telling you what I won't do. I'm telling you what I'm particularly useful for." Mara was quiet for a moment. "You're running from a pack," she said. "Yes." "High-ranked?" "Yes." "They'll look for you." Seraphine thought of Kalen standing at a window. She thought of the exact nature of his pride. Not cruelty, not viciousness, but the specific inflexibility of a man who had never been required to be wrong about something that mattered. She thought of Casimir's soft hands and careful voice. "No," she said. "They won't." Mara studied her for another long moment. Then she nodded, once, with the decisive brevity of a woman who made decisions based on available information and then didn't second-guess them. "The East End building needs a new roof before winter. You can start there. We'll figure out the rest as it comes." The rest as it came took 3 years. It started with the roof, which Seraphine built correctly on the second attempt after the first attempt revealed a drainage problem she hadn't accounted for. It expanded when the graywash community's ongoing dispute with the neighboring settlement over river access came to a head, and Seraphine sat down with both parties' representatives and asked, one by one, not what they wanted but what they actually needed, and found that what both parties needed was a fair allocation system and someone to enforce it, neither of which required either party to lose. The agreement she wrote in 2 days held for the next 4 years without a violation. The representative from the neighboring settlement looked at it and said, "Who wrote this?" "She did," Mara said, gesturing to Seraphine, who was patching a fence section 30 feet away with her sleeves rolled up and mud on her forearms. Word traveled the way it always traveled in unclaimed territory. Slowly, then all at once. By the time Seraphine delivered her children, twins, a boy and a girl, born in the early hours of a spring morning with Mara's capable hands and the quiet competence of a woman she'd been training as a medic for the past 4 months attending, the graywash community had doubled in size. The newcomers were not drawn by anything mystical. They were drawn by the practical reality that this was a place where disputes got resolved, where supply routes worked, where the protection arrangements with neighboring communities were written down and honored, and where the person who had built all of that was available on any given morning, visibly working, and could be argued with. She named her son Kalen because it was close enough to his father's name that she would always know what it meant, and far enough that no one else would make the connection. She named her daughter Lyra because the first time she held her, in the gray spring morning light, the child looked up at her with eyes that were already starting to show the silver that meant wolf blood, and Seraphine felt something in her chest that was beyond language, and that was the only thing she had, in 3 years, allowed herself to simply feel without immediately analyzing. She held them for 1 hour. Then she gave them to Mara to watch, and she went back to work because the alternative was to sit still with what she'd done and what she'd lost, and the particular weight of raising 2 people alone in a world that hadn't been designed with any of this in mind, and she was not ready for that weight yet. She would get ready for it slowly, the same way she had gotten ready for everything else, one task at a time, with the full attention of someone who had decided, in a dark storeroom with her hands pressed to her abdomen, that survival was not the same thing as living, but that you couldn't get to the second one without doing the first. The twins grew, and Seraphine built, proud. 6 years after she crossed out of Silvercrest territory, she sat in a room that had not existed when she arrived. A proper council chamber, timber-framed, with maps on 3 walls and a long table that could seat 14, across from the representatives of 4 neighboring territories, 2 of which were wolf packs, and 2 of which were mixed human-wolf communities. And she laid out the terms of a unified border defense arrangement that she had been working toward piece by piece for the past 18 months. The territory she'd built had no formal name yet. The people who lived there called it the Borderlands, which was insufficiently specific but carried the right connotation. A place where the categories didn't fully apply, where what mattered was what you could do and what agreements you honored, where nobody's claim was absolute. Seraphine was not its queen. She had resisted every attempt to give her a title, not from modesty but from strategy. A title was a target, an obligation, a limitation. What she was instead was the person who had built the arrangement that everyone at this table depended on, which was a different and more durable kind of authority. The Wolfpack representative, a weathered alpha named Dressed from the Ironfall Pack, who had come to this table 3 years ago skeptical and hostile, and who was now, she suspected, one of the most committed supporters of what she was building, not because she had charmed him, but because she had proved useful to him repeatedly, and without ever asking for acknowledgement in return. Dressed leaned forward and said, "The Ashvale delegation is talking about formalization." "I know," Seraphine said. "They want to put your name on a treaty as a governing authority." "I know. You're going to keep saying no." Seraphine looked at the map on the wall behind him. The territories that had, piece by piece, signed agreements with her arrangement, the supply routes that ran through them, the dispute resolution procedures that had replaced 3 separate territorial wars in the past 4 years, the training program that had, gradually, built a combined border guard from wolf and human fighters who had initially refused to work alongside each other. "Not forever," she said. "Not yet." Dressed studied her. He was the kind of man who had survived by reading people accurately, and what he read in her face now was not the ambivalence it might have appeared. "There's something you're waiting for." She didn't answer him directly. She turned the conversation back to the border defense arrangement, and they worked through it clause by clause for the next 2 hours. And when the meeting ended and the representatives filed out, Mara came in with 2 cups of tea and sat down across from Seraphine without being invited, because Mara had never waited for an invitation in her life. "Dressed isn't wrong," Mara said. "He's often not wrong." "What are you waiting for?" Seraphine wrapped both hands around her cup. Outside, she could hear Kaylin and Lyra, 7 years old now, relentlessly physical, conducting what sounded like a dispute about something in the yard that would sort itself out or require intervention in approximately 4 minutes. She had learned to tell the difference. She was quiet for long enough that Mara's expression shifted from inquiry to attention. "The war," Seraphine said. Mara looked at her. "There's been low-level conflict between the Eastern Kingdoms for 3 years, Seraphine said. "I've been watching the pattern. Casimir Vorn's influence is in it. He's been manipulating border disputes to pull Silvercrest into engagements that drain its resources without decisive outcomes. Kaylin is fighting the wars Casimir sets up for him. He doesn't see it yet." She paused. "When it breaks fully, and it will break, within the next 18 months, 2 years at the outside, it won't be a border skirmish. It'll be the kind of war that redraws everything, and when it does, every kingdom on this continent is going to need something they don't currently have. Which is," Seraphine set down her cup, "someone who's already built the framework they're going to need to survive it." Mara was quiet for a moment. "You've been building toward that." "I've been building because this place needed building," Seraphine said carefully. "The fact that it will also matter when the war comes is—" She stopped, reconsidered, chose honesty over careful framing. "I've been building because I knew, the night I left, that I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life small. I was going to spend it doing something that mattered. The war is when that becomes visible." "And Kaylin?" The name sat in the air between them. "He'll come when he has no other choice," Seraphine said. "Proud men always wait until they have no other choice." "And when he does?" Seraphine looked at the map. At the 8-year-old network of agreements and routes and relationships she had built from a cut hand and a settlement with 40 people, and the conviction that survival was only the beginning. "Then he'll see what I built," she said. "And then we'll have the conversation we should have had 8 years ago." Mara looked at her for a long moment. "You're not still in love with him?" It wasn't quite a question. Seraphine picked up her cup again. "Ask me that when he's standing in front of me." Outside, the children's dispute had escalated past the self-resolving threshold, and Seraphine stood up, set down her cup, and went to deal with it. Because that was the work, the same as it had always been. The small things and the large things all requiring the same attention, all requiring a person who showed up. She did not think about Kaelin Draven again that day, or so she told herself. The messenger arrived on a Tuesday morning, mud-spattered and visibly exhausted, carrying the silver crest seal on his dispatch pouch, a seal she had not seen in 8 years. And she knew, the moment she saw that seal from across the yard, that the timeline had moved. She intercepted him before he reached the main building. She took the dispatch pouch herself. She sent him to the kitchen for food without opening it where he could see her face. She walked to the edge of the yard, where the old apple tree stood, the one that had been there when she arrived, and that Kaelin had fallen out of twice, and that bore fruit every fall that was too sour to eat raw, but made excellent preserves. She stood under it with the dispatch pouch in her hands, and she opened it. The letter inside was not from Kaelin. It was from Elder Rowan Tetch. She read it once, quickly. Then she stood still for a moment, looking at the words without reading them, feeling the specific weight of a thing that you have known was coming for a very long time, but that still, when it arrives, requires a breath. Then she read it again. Tetch wrote in the careful, elaborate style of a man who had spent 60 years in political service and had learned to say things without quite saying them. What he was saying, in the gaps between the formal language, was this: the war had broken. Not in 18 months, now. The Eastern Alliance had fractured, and Silvercrest's northern border was already under engagement. Kaelin had committed pack forces to 3 separate fronts simultaneously, which was either Casimir's advice or Casimir's sabotage, and the distinction no longer mattered because the outcome was the same. And there was more. At the bottom of the letter, in the same careful hand but with the faint tremor of a man writing something he had perhaps been working toward for years, Tetch wrote, "The Queen of the Borderlands commands considerable influence. Her methods of conflict resolution are spoken of with respect even in circles that would not openly acknowledge them. If she were to receive an envoy from Silvercrest requesting consultation, it is possible that certain members of this council would find her reception of such an envoy to be of significant political weight. The king does not know of this letter. The king believes he is sending his senior generals south to negotiate terms with an unaffiliated border queen. He does not yet know who that queen is." Seraphine stood under the apple tree for a long time. 8 years. 8 years of mornings that started before dawn and ended after dark, of building something from nothing, of raising 2 children alone, of watching the reports from Silvercrest and knowing that the crumbling was happening exactly the way she had read it would happen that night in the dark storage room. 8 years of not sending a letter. Not once. Because there was nothing to say that would not be intercepted and reframed and used, and because she had learned, that night, that words without power behind them were not protection but exposure. Now she had power behind them. The senior general Kaelin was sending south. She knew who it would be. There was only one General Kaelin trusted above all others, only one man he would send to negotiate something this politically sensitive, only one man who was still alive and still in his inner circle who had the diplomatic fluency for it. She turned and walked back toward the main building. At the door, Lyra was waiting, 7 years old, silver-eyed, with her mother's cheekbones and her father's jaw, and a look of complete certainty on her face that she deployed several times daily toward problems she had decided to solve. "The messenger ate 3 bowls," she announced. "Kaelin bet him he couldn't eat 4. "Tell Kaelin to stop gambling with the household food stores," Seraphine said, and her voice came out even and clear, the way it always did, the way she had trained it to. She went inside. She sat down at the desk where she wrote her treaty language and her dispatch letters and her careful, patient plans, and she took a fresh sheet of paper. She wrote 1 line. Then she folded it, sealed it, and gave it to a runner to take back to the exhausted messenger with instructions to carry it north, to the Silvercrest Keep, to no specific recipient, just the senior general who would be heading south within the week. The line said, "I know who you are. Come alone." She was already standing at the window when the runner left the yard, watching the direction of the road north, and what she was feeling, for the first time in 8 years, was something that was not quite anticipation and not quite dread, but which lived in the precise space between them, in the place where things that have been delayed for a very long time finally begin to move. And then the runner stopped, turned back, came fast across the yard with the look of someone who had made a mistake or discovered something wrong, and Seraphine was already moving before she knew why, through the door and down the steps and out into the yard where the runner reached her and said, breathing hard, "He didn't go north. The messenger, he wasn't going north. His horse is already packed south. He's already heading back the way he came, but he took a different pouch with him than the one he brought." Seraphine went still. "Which pouch?" "The one from your writing desk. He had the key." She turned and went back up the steps, through the door to the writing desk. The drawer was open. The secondary dispatch pouch, the one she kept for sensitive correspondence, the one with her current seal and 2 of her active treaty documents, and the route maps she had not yet finalized, was gone. She stood in the quiet room with the open drawer and the missing pouch and the letter from Tetch still in her hand, and she understood. It wasn't Tetch who had set this in motion. It was Casimir. And the messenger she had fed and housed and sent away with her own written words was not lost and exhausted. He had known exactly where he was going, and he had come here for exactly this, and she had let him in, and somewhere between Tetch's letter and the apple tree and her daughter's face in the doorway, she had made the one mistake she had spent 8 years training herself not to make. She had allowed herself to believe she had more time. She moved before she finished the thought. Not toward the door. That was the instinct, but instinct without calculation was just panic with good timing. She went to the window instead, the one that faced the south yard, and she watched. The messenger's horse was already at the far edge of the yard, moving at a controlled canter that looked casual and was not casual. It was the specific pace of a man covering ground without appearing to hurry, the gait of someone trained to depart clean. She had maybe 4 minutes before he cleared the outer boundary of the settlement. She turned from the window and walked, not ran, to the door at the back of the building that opened onto the maintenance passage running parallel to the south yard's fence line. She went through it without breaking stride and came out on the other side moving fast, cutting the angle, reaching the boundary gate a full 30 seconds before the messenger's horse reached the South Road junction. She stepped into the road. The horse shied. The messenger brought it under control with practiced hands and looked down at her with an expression that had been prepared for this. Calm, slightly apologetic, carrying the specific blankness of a man who had a story ready. "Luna? Don't." Her voice came out level and cold, and she watched him recalibrate. "Get off the horse." "I was instructed to return immediately upon delivery. My orders." "You have 2 options," Seraphine said. "You get off the horse and we talk, or I pull you off the horse and we talk. One of those options leaves you in better condition for the conversation." He got off the horse. She looked at him, really looked, the way she had been trained to read a room and had extended over the years to reading individual people. The mud on his boots was wrong, too uniform, applied rather than accumulated. The exhaustion he'd carried into the settlement had been real, which meant he'd ridden hard to get here, but not from Silver Crest, the wrong kind of dirt on the horse's legs, the wrong angle of wear on the saddlebags. He'd ridden from the east, maybe 3 days hard travel. "Who sent you?" she said. "Elder Tetch. Tetch wrote the letter," she said. "Who sent you?" "He was good." The pause was barely there. "I served the Silvercrest Council." Casimir Vorn. Nothing on his face, which was itself an answer. A genuine denial would have produced something, even a controlled something. Blankness was the face of a man deciding how much to give up. "The pouch," she said. "Give it back." "I don't know what—" "You had a key to my desk drawer that you didn't get from me, which means someone gave it to you before you left. which means someone in this settlement has been reporting my correspondence storage locations, which I will deal with separately. The pouch. Now. He looked at her for a long moment. She watched him calculate, not whether to give it back, but whether the information she might extract from the pouch's contents was more dangerous than the information she was currently extracting from his face. He reached into his coat and gave her the pouch. She opened it without looking away from him, checked the contents with her fingers. The treaty documents were there, the route maps, everything intact. She closed it and put it under her arm. "Here's what you're going to do," she said. "You're going to ride back to whoever sent you and tell them that the pouch contained route maps for the Western River crossing and a draft of the Iron Fall supply agreement. Tell them nothing else was there. Tell them you saw no personal correspondence, no strategic documents, nothing relevant to the king's situation." He blinked, just slightly. "You're telling me to lie to my principal." "I'm telling you to give your principal a true statement about a false premise. The pouch doesn't contain what they sent you to find because what they sent you to find doesn't exist in any retrievable form." She held his gaze. "And I'm telling you this because you're a working man who took a difficult assignment, and I have no particular interest in your suffering. But if you report accurately about what I've just said to you, I will know it, and I will send a full account of this interaction, including the timing of your arrival, the key you carried, and the specific contents of the pouch, to the Ironfall Pack, the Ashvale delegation, and every allied territory within my network. Do you understand what that means?" She watched him understand what that meant. "Yes." "Good. Ride east." He rode east. She stood in the road until the sound of his horse faded, and then she stood there for another minute, alone with the smell of road dust and the weight of what had just shifted. Casimir knew where she was. He had known for some time, long enough to place someone in the settlement with a key to her desk, which required either months of patient infiltration or, more likely, a bribe that had been accepted quietly and without anyone coming to tell her. That was the more uncomfortable possibility. Not a planted operative, but someone already here, someone she had worked alongside, who had decided that whatever Casimir was offering was worth more than what they had built together. She filed that problem in the place where she put things that needed thought she didn't currently have capacity for, and she walked back to the settlement. Mara was in the kitchen when Seraphine came back in, and she took one look at Seraphine's face and poured a second cup without being asked and set it on the table without saying anything. Mara had the particular gift of knowing which silences were necessary. Seraphine sat down. She wrapped both hands around the cup and she thought. The timeline had collapsed. Whatever runway she'd believed she had, 2 years, 18 months, the careful approach of a war she'd been preparing for, was gone. Casimir knew she was here, which meant that whatever he had planned for her appearance in the political landscape would now accelerate, because leaving her in place and undisclosed was no longer an option for him. He would move to define her before she could define herself. "Someone in the settlement has been reporting to Silvercrest," she said. Mara's face didn't change. "How long?" "Long enough that they had a key to my desk drawer. Months. Maybe longer." Mara set down her cup. Her expression was the expression of a woman who was working through something painful in real time and refusing to externalize the pain because externalization wasn't useful. "Do you know who?" "Not yet." "How do you want to handle it?" Seraphine looked at the table. She thought about Casimir's voice in that corridor, nothing violent, and the specific horror of how reasonable it had sounded. She thought about the difference between the response that felt right, which was immediate and confrontational, and the response that was right, which was deliberate and controlled. "Quietly," she said. "Whoever it is, they're more useful to me thinking their access is intact. If I expose them now, Casimir knows his line of information is cut. If I leave it in place and manage what moves through it, you use it. I use it." Mara looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across her face that was close to pride and also close to something more complicated. The expression of a woman who had watched someone she loved become something formidable and was not entirely sure how she felt about what that cost. "The war?" Mara said. "Moving faster than the report suggested. Casimir has been accelerating it." Seraphine turned the cup in her hands. He needs Silvercrest destabilized before I can formalize this territory's position. If I'm an established political authority when the war peaks, I'm a factor he can't control. If he can define me as a fugitive Luna with a stolen seal before I can establish my own definition, he wins. He gets another decade, yes. So you formalize now. Seraphine was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear the yard, the daily noise of the settlement, the specific texture of a place that had become real and alive and full of people who had built something they believed in. She thought about what formalization meant, what it would cost, what it would change. I call the council, she said, all 4 territories. I tell them it's time. And your name goes on the treaty. My name goes on the treaty. Mara nodded once, then, and the children. Seraphine looked up. Kaylin and Lyra, Mara said, in the quiet, precise voice she used when she was going to say something that needed saying. If you put your name on a treaty, your name is on a treaty, and anyone looking for a Luna who fled Silvercrest 8 years ago with her seal and a secret is going to do the arithmetic. The room was quiet. I know, Seraphine said. Do they know? About their father? Seraphine thought of Kaylin, 7 years old, silver-eyed, who asked the direct, unanswerable questions that children asked because they hadn't yet learned that some questions were supposed to be avoided. He had asked, 3 months ago, in the matter-of-fact tone of someone raising a practical issue, do I have a father, or did you just decide to have us by yourself? She had told him that his father was a king and that the situation was complicated, and that she would explain everything when he was older. He had received this with the expression of someone who found it deeply unsatisfactory but was willing to table it temporarily. They know he exists, Seraphine said. They know it's complicated. When the treaty goes public, I know, Mara. I'm not criticizing. I'm telling you what's coming so you can be ready for it. Seraphine set down her cup. She sat with the silence for a moment, and in it she felt the full weight of the 8 years. Not with regret, because regret required believing there had been a better option, and there hadn't been, and she knew that, but with the specific gravity of a person who had been carrying something heavy for a long time, and who could now see, at the far end of the road, the place where she would finally be able to put it down. I know, she said again, and this time it was different. Yeah. The council meeting was called for 3 days hence, which was faster than Seraphine had ever convened one before, and which told the 4 territorial representatives, when they arrived, that something had shifted. They came with their senior advisors and their guarded expressions, and they sat around the long table and looked at her. She stood at the head of the table without sitting down, which she had never done before. And the standing itself was a signal, the kind that didn't require language. I'm going to tell you who I am, she said. Not what I've told you before, which was true as far as it went. All of it. The room was quiet in the way that a room gets quiet when people are paying the kind of attention that precedes a decision. My name is Seraphine Ashmore. I was Luna of the Silvercrest Pack. 8 years ago, I left Silvercrest ahead of a political conspiracy that would have destroyed my position and used my removal to consolidate control over the Pack's border territories. She held Drest's gaze when she said this, because Drest was the one most likely to react from a place of Pack loyalty rather than pragmatic assessment, and she needed to read his face in real time. I left voluntarily and without announcing myself, because the alternative was to be destroyed by men who had better access to the king's trust than I did, and because I was pregnant and my children's safety was not a thing I was willing to gamble on someone else's belief in my innocence. Drest's jaw was tight. Not hostile, calculating. She continued, I built this territory from the ground because it needed building and because I needed a place to build it. I have not been working against Silvercrest. I have not been working for Silvercrest. I have been building something that exists independent of both, because the politics of the established packs were not what this region needed and were not what I had the standing to leverage. She paused. That standing is what I'm asking you to give me now. A formal title, said the Ashvale representative, a woman named Petra, sharp-faced and precise, who had been Seraphine's most useful ally and her most exacting critic for the past 4 years. A formal designation, the treaty you've all been suggesting for the past 18 months, with my name on it as governing authority of this territory. Why now? Petra asked. Because Silvercrest knows where I am. Because the war is moving faster than projected. Because if I wait until the political moment is perfect, I will be defined by someone else before I can define myself. The king, Drest said. Yes. He'll send someone. He already has. Drest leaned back. He looked at the table, and then at her, and she could see him doing what she had watched him do in 3 years of council meetings, stripping out everything except the practical core of a situation. If we sign the treaty and put your name on it, we're in it. Whatever comes from Silvercrest, whatever this war brings, we're standing behind your position. Yes. That's a significant commitment for territories that have survived by staying out of pack politics. You've been in pack politics for 3 years, Seraphine said. You've just been in them through me, with my name kept out of the documentation. What you're being asked to do now is make visible what already exists. She looked around the table. The alternative is to wait, to let me remain officially ambiguous while the war accelerates, and to watch Casimir Vorn define this territory's political position for us from a distance. He will do it. He's very good at it. The silence that followed was the working kind. 4 people turning over the same problem from their individual angles, looking for the catch, finding only the shape of a situation that had already made itself. Petra spoke first. I'll sign. Then the 2 mixed territory representatives in quick succession. Drest was last. He looked at her for a long moment across the table with the expression of a man who had made his calculation and was now deciding how much to say about it. The king won't like it, he said. No. He'll come himself, eventually. Men like that always come themselves. I know. You ready for that? Seraphine held his gaze. I've been ready for that for 8 years. Drest looked at her for another moment. Then he picked up the pen. On. The treaty was signed before nightfall. Petra's people had a seal press with them. Petra always had a seal press with her because Petra was the kind of woman who brought what she needed rather than apologizing for not having it. And by the time the Valley Light had gone amber and flat, the document existed, with all 5 signatures and all 5 seals, and Seraphine's name was at the top of it in the clean, precise script she had learned in Silvercrest's records office, under a tutor who had told her that a Luna who couldn't read a formal document was a Luna who would always be managed by the people who could. She had that tutor to thank for several things. She sent copies to 7 locations simultaneously, via 7 different writers going 7 different routes, because a single copy was a document and multiple distributed copies were a fact, and facts were much harder to quietly unmake than documents. When the writers left, she went to find her children. They were in the east yard, where the light lasted longest, doing the thing they often did at the end of the day. Sitting in the grass near the fence, with Kaylin explaining something to Lyra in the tone of someone who was not entirely sure of his information, but was fully committed to his authority on the subject. Lyra was listening with the expression of someone who was taking notes in order to rebut them later. Seraphine sat down in the grass beside them without announcing herself, and Kaylin paused his explanation and looked at her. And something in his face, the silver eyes that were her eyes but with the set of someone else's brow, registered that this was a different kind of arriving than the usual end-of-day kind. Something happened, he said. Yes. Are we in trouble? She considered lying. She considered the simplified version, the age-appropriate version, the version that would protect them from information they couldn't yet process. She thought about the version of herself that had once trusted the wrong people with too little information and had not been protected by that trust. Things are changing, she said. I signed a treaty today that puts my name on this territory officially. That means people from my past are going to find out where we are. Some of those people are going to come here. Lyra was watching her with the focused, still attention she brought to problems she was treating seriously. The king, she said. Not a question. Eventually, yes. Our father, Kaylin said. Yes. The words sat in the evening air. Kaylin looked at the fence post. He was quiet for long enough that Seraphine let the silence stand rather than filling it, because he was a person who needed room to work through things, and she had learned that early. Is he why you left? He said. No, she said. I left because people around him were trying to destroy me. He didn't know. But he let you go. She looked at her son, 7 years old, and already asking the questions that cut straight to the actual shape of things. Yes, she said, he let me go. Kaylin thought about this. So he was wrong. Yes. Is he going to come here and pretend he wasn't? Something in Seraphine's chest tightened and released. He might try. What are you going to do? She looked out over the valley, at the fading light on the ridgeline to the north, at the territory that 8 years of her life and all of her stubbornness had built into something real. I'm going to make sure, she said slowly, that when he gets here, he has to look at everything I built, and then he has to decide what he's going to do with that. Lyra reached over and put her small hand on top of Seraphine's without saying anything. It was such a complete gesture, so precisely the right thing, that Seraphine felt the back of her throat tighten for 1 second before she controlled it. Okay, Kaylin said, with the tone of someone concluding a negotiation. But if he's rude to you, I'm going to say something. You're 7. I'm almost 8. That doesn't... I'm almost 8, and I'm a future alpha, and I'm allowed to say something. Seraphine looked at her son's face, entirely serious, entirely committed, entirely prepared to walk into a confrontation with an alpha king on her behalf. And she felt something she had not let herself feel in a very long time, which was the specific, almost unbearable warmth of being loved by someone who hadn't yet learned to calculate the cost. All right, she said, you can say something. Good. He went back to explaining whatever he'd been explaining to Lyra, and Lyra went back to her expression of interested skepticism, and Seraphine sat in the grass between them with her hand under her daughter's and the treaty already in transit to 7 destinations and the war already moving, and she let herself have the moment exactly as it was. She didn't know yet that the rider going northeast, the one carrying the copy she'd intended for the Crestfall elders, had been intercepted before the second relay point. She didn't know that the copy he carried had been taken from him intact and was now in different hands. She didn't know that it would reach Silvercrest before any of her other riders reached their destinations, and that it would arrive not in Elder Tetch's hands, but in Aldrich Morn's. She didn't know that Aldrich Morn would read her name on the treaty and then read it again, and that the expression on his face would be the specific expression of a man who has been waiting for a consequence to arrive for 8 years and has now watched it come through the door. She didn't know that he would take the treaty directly to Kaylin. She found out the next morning when a second messenger arrived. Not a spy this time, not someone with a false pouch or a planted key, but a young woman riding a horse she'd clearly pushed hard, carrying nothing except a verbal message and a Silvercrest seal burned directly into the leather of her riding glove as identification. The message was 4 words. He's already riding south. Seraphine read the 4 words twice, and then handed the message back to the young woman and told her to rest her horse and eat something from the kitchen, said it with the flat steadiness of someone who had already finished feeling the thing the message was designed to make her feel and had moved on to what came next. She walked to the council room. She stood at the map wall and looked at the northern road. He's already riding south. Not in 2 weeks. Not with a diplomatic envoy and advance correspondence and the careful political staging that a king negotiating with a foreign authority would arrange. Already riding. Which meant he had left Silvercrest within hours of seeing the treaty. Which meant Aldrich had brought it to him at night. Which meant Kaylin Draven had read her name on a document and had not slept and had not waited and had done the thing that proud men do when the thing they thought they understood turns out to have been something else entirely. He was coming fast, and he was coming without thinking it through, and that was the most dangerous version of Kaylin she knew. She had 3 days. Maybe 4 if his horse threw a shoe or the northern pass was slower than usual in the early spring mud. She needed to use all of them. She pulled the route map from the wall and spread it flat on the table and began to work. The first day she spent on logistics, repositioning the border guard rotation so that the approach routes from the north had visible presence without appearing staged, preparing the main hall for a formal meeting without making it look like she had prepared it, sending word to Drest and Petra that the situation had accelerated and that their presence was no longer optional if they wanted to have any say in how the next week unfolded. The second day she spent on her children. She told them more than she had told them before. Not everything. Kaylin was 7 and Lyra was 7, and there were things about betrayal and political conspiracy that required more language than 7-year-olds had, not because they lacked intelligence, but because some kinds of understanding needed more experience underneath them to hold their weight. But she told them the shape of it. She told them that their father was a king who had made a serious mistake, and that the people around him had made that mistake easy to make. She told them that when he arrived, he would be seeing things that would require him to change what he understood about the past 8 years, and that this was going to be hard for him, and that hard things for powerful people sometimes came out as anger. "Is he going to be angry at us?" Lyra asked. "No," Seraphine said. "He won't be angry at you." "Is he going to be angry at you?" She thought about the specific quality of Kaelin's anger, the way it ran cold rather than hot, the way it went very still and very precise before it said anything. "Maybe. Yes. Probably." "Because you left?" "Because I left without explaining, and because I've been here for 8 years building something that changes what he thought he knew, and because proud men find that kind of information very difficult to absorb." She paused. "But his anger is his to manage. My job is to tell him the truth. His job is to decide what to do with it." Kaelin had been quiet through this. He was doing the thing he did when he was working through something genuinely complex. Very still, eyes focused on something slightly to the left of what he was ostensibly looking at, his hands loose in his lap. "Do you still love him?" he asked. Seraphine looked at her son's face. She had asked herself this question in the dark, in the quiet, in the particular exhaustion of late nights when the settlement was asleep and the work was done, and there was nothing left to occupy the parts of her mind that she normally kept busy. She had answered it differently on different nights, and the different answers had all been true at the time, which told her something about the question itself. "I don't know yet," she said. "I think I need to see him first." Kaelin accepted this with the gravity of someone filing away information for later use. "Okay," he said, and then, because he was Kaelin, "but I'm still allowed to say something if he's rude." "I remember." Kaelin Draven arrived on the afternoon of the 3rd day. He came with 6 riders, which was a reduced escort for a king, and which told her, before she saw his face, that he had not told his full council where he was going. The 6 riders were personal guard, people loyal to him specifically, not to the council's oversight of his movements. He had ridden out of Silvercrest the way a man leaves a room where he can no longer breathe, fast, and without arranging things first. She watched him come up the south road from the window of the main hall, and she had time, in those 2 minutes before he reached the gate, to simply look at him without being seen. 8 years. He was leaner than she remembered, and the leanness wasn't from discipline. It was from the particular thinning that happened to men who carried sustained, unresolved weight. There was gray at his temples that hadn't been there before. He sat his horse the same way, with the specific straightness of someone who had been trained from childhood to take up exactly as much space as he occupied and no more. His face, at this distance, was the face of a man who had been composing himself for 3 days of hard riding and who was going to need everything he'd composed in the next 10 minutes. She stepped back from the window. She went to the main hall and stood at the far end of the table, and she waited. She heard him come through the gate. She heard the exchange with the outer guard. His voice, low and controlled, asking for the Queen of the Borderlands. She heard the brief silence when someone replied that the Queen was expecting him. She heard his footsteps cross the yard. The door opened. He came in alone. He'd left his guard outside, which was either trust or the understanding that whatever was about to happen didn't need witnesses. He stepped through the doorway and into the hall, and he stopped. She watched him look at her. 8 years was a specific thing. It didn't just change faces. It changed the way a person stood, the things they carried in their posture, the kind of steadiness that came from having survived things. She knew she looked different, not just older, but different in the way that people look different when they had been fully used by their own life. She watched him take that in. She watched something move across his face that she couldn't quite name, and that was gone before it fully formed. "Seraphine," he said. "Kaelin." The room held the silence for a moment. She didn't move toward him. He didn't move toward her. The table was between them, long and solid, and neither of them made any gesture toward reducing the distance. "You're alive," he said, and the way he said it, not with relief, not with anger, but with the flat tone of a man who has just had a very large assumption removed from under him, told her that on some level, beneath the 8 years of whatever story he had told himself, he had believed she was dead. "I'm alive," she said. His jaw tightened, the cold anger tell. She'd know it in the dark. "You want to tell me what the last 8 years have been?" "Yes. Sit down." Something moved in his eyes at being told to sit down in a room that wasn't his by a woman who used to be his Luna in a territory he'd never seen before. He sat down. Not easily. The sitting was a controlled decision, not a concession, but he sat. She told him. She told him cleanly and without embellishment. She did not perform the pain of it, and she did not minimize it. She told him what she had heard in the corridor, what Casimir had said, what Aldrich had said. She told him what she had thought in the dark storeroom and why she had concluded that staying was not survivable and that telling him was not safe. She told him about the Northern Pass and the Greywash settlement and Mara, and she told him about the 8 years, the building, the treaties, the border guard, the supply networks, all of it. She told him about the twins. She watched his face when she said it. The face of a man receiving information that restructures everything he thought he knew was not one expression. It was a sequence. The rapid, almost invisible cycling through incomprehension, then the first shape of understanding, then the specific quality of a man who has just found out that something he didn't know he'd lost has existed for 8 years without him. That last one stayed. It settled in the lines around his mouth and the set of his hands on the table, and it looked like something that would take a long time to become anything else. "Twins," he said, "a boy and a girl, Kaylin and Lyra. They're here. They're here." He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was still controlled, but something underneath it had changed pitch. "You raised them alone?" "Yes." "For 8 years?" "Yes." "And you never—" He stopped. Started again. There was no way to send word. "I chose not to send word," she said carefully and precisely, because she would not let that become something it wasn't. Not because I couldn't, because sending word at any point in the first years would have told Casimir's network where I was before I had anything strong enough to protect myself and the children with. The moment I was strong enough, I put my name on a treaty. That was the word. A treaty. His voice had gone very flat. "You sent a treaty." It was the only communication that came with its own defense. He stood up. Not in anger. The movement was too controlled for anger. He walked to the window that faced the yard, the same window she had stood at 3 days ago watching the northern road, and he stood there with his back to her for long enough that she let the silence run. "Tell me what Casimir said," he said, without turning around. "Exactly. Every word you remember." She told him. He listened with his back to her, not moving, with the stillness of a man running a different version of the past 8 years through his mind in real time, locating every moment where a hand had guided him toward a specific interpretation of events, finding them. She could tell he was finding them, from the quality of his stillness, the way it got denser rather than lighter as she spoke. When she finished, the room was very quiet. "Aldrich," he said. "Yes." He was in the room. He said, "What are you proposing?" Not, "What do you mean?" Not, "I don't follow." He already knew. Kaylin was quiet for a long time. Then he turned around, and the look on his face was not the look she had braced herself for, not the defensive anger of a man protecting his own judgment, not the deflection of someone not ready to be wrong. It was the specific terrible look of a man who had just understood something about himself that he could not unfind, and who was not going to look away from it. "I let you go," he said. "Yes. I chose to believe—" "You chose the interpretation that was easiest for your pride," she said, and said it without cruelty, only with the flatness of a thing that was true. "I know, I knew you would. That was part of why I didn't try to argue it." His jaw tightened again. He looked at her for a long moment with something working hard behind his eyes. "That's what you thought of me." "That's what I knew of you," she said. "It wasn't a judgment. It was a calculation." "There's a difference?" "Yes. A judgment is about what someone is. A calculation is about what someone does." What you do and what you are aren't the same thing, Kaylin. They weren't the same thing 8 years ago, and they aren't now. He absorbed this. She watched him absorb it, and in the way he absorbed it, the slight shift in his shoulders, the breath he took that was slightly too deliberate to be unconscious, she saw something she recognized from the early years of their bond, the specific quality of Kaylin Draven actually thinking rather than reacting. It had always been there. It had always been what made him worth the difficulty of him. He said, "I want to meet them." "I know." "Tonight?" She looked at him, really looked, the way she had looked at the messenger in the road, reading what was real underneath what was presented. What she saw was a man on the far edge of 3 days without sleep, running on the fuel of an emotional acceleration that was going to crash at some point, and crash hard, asking to meet his children for the first time without having slept or eaten or processed any fraction of what she had just told him. "Tomorrow," she said. "You'll eat tonight and sleep, and tomorrow you'll meet them when you're a person, rather than a state of emergency." He looked like he was going to argue. Then he looked like he was going to argue less. "There are rooms in the East Building," she said. "I'll have food sent." He nodded, once, and she moved to leave. And then he said her name, just her name, the way he'd said it when he first walked in, but different now, carrying more weight. And she stopped without turning around. "The conspiracy," he said. "Casimir, Aldrich, there's more." She turned. His face had changed. The something working behind his eyes had resolved into something specific and cold, and she recognized this version of him too. Not the proud man making easy choices, but the alpha king who had survived long enough to build an empire, and who, when he finally decided that something needed to be dismantled, was very thorough about it. "Tell me," she said. "Rowan Tetch sent you that letter." "Yes." "Tetch has been feeding me information about the border conflicts for 3 years. I thought he was being useful. I think now he was managing what I knew and didn't know about the Eastern situation, specifically about this territory." He looked at her. "If Tetch wrote to you independently, he's breaking from Casimir. That means something has shifted in the council, something that scared Tetch enough to reach for an exit." Seraphine stood very still. What shifted?" she said, and her voice came out level, but something in her chest was recalibrating. The part of her that had mapped this landscape for years, that had tracked the political weather of Silvercrest from a distance the way a navigator tracked storm patterns, and that was now receiving data that didn't fit the model she'd been operating on. 2 weeks ago, Kaylin said, Casimir presented the council with a proposal, a formal alliance with the Duskmere Pack, the Eastern Alliance's senior member, a political marriage. He recommended it as a strategic counter to the border war. "A marriage," Seraphine said carefully. "Yes." "With whom?" Kaylin's eyes held hers. "With the council's approval, the Alpha King of Silvercrest would formally take a new mate, cementing the alliance." He paused. Casimir argued that the king's unbonded status was a political vulnerability and that the Luna's position had been effectively vacant for 8 years. The air in the room did something that air did when a structure that had been holding weight finally showed its crack. Seraphine heard the words. She heard them, and she found, with something that was not quite surprise, she had known Casimir was precise. She had known he was patient. She had known that 8 years was not too long for a man like that to wait for his next move. That this was the shape of what he had always been building toward. Not just removing her. Not just taking control of the border territories. Building a silver crest aligned to Duskmere, locked into an Eastern alliance that Casimir could shape, with a king married to a woman from a pack that owed Casimir its alliance, and with the border territories controlled by council intermediaries, and with no Luna whose diplomatic network or independent authority could threaten any of it. The whole 8 years, her exile, the managed wars, the slow erosion of Kaylin's independent power, it had been a single long plan. And Tetch had finally broken because Tetch, whatever his crimes, had not signed up for this ending. "Did Kaylin accept the proposal?" she said, and heard herself use his name in the third person, which was not what she'd meant to do. "I'm standing in your hall," he said. "What do you think?" She looked at him. "I told Casimir I would consider it," he said. "I needed time to leave without triggering suspicion. I told him I was riding south to negotiate with the border queen. He has no idea." He stopped. Something shifted in his face. The precision behind his eyes went very fast from calculation to something else. The specific look of a man catching something he should have caught sooner. "He knows exactly where I am," Kaelin said, very quietly. Seraphine felt it at the same moment. "The treaty copy that was intercepted. If Aldrich took it to me, he took it knowing I would come here. He took it knowing I would leave Silver Crest." He looked at her. "He didn't take it to me because the treaty surprised him." She finished the thought. "He took it to you because sending you here was the plan." The room went very quiet. Kaelin was here without his counsel's knowledge, or so he believed. He was here with 6 personal guards in unfamiliar territory, separated from his pack, his authority, his institutional leverage. And somewhere behind him, Casimir Vorn was in Silvercrest with a council that had just approved a marriage alliance, with the king absent and no stated return date, with the border territories already being funneled toward council control, and with every piece in position. They had not sent Kaelin south to negotiate. They had sent him south to be removed from the board. And she, Seraphine, with her signed treaty and her distributed copies and her rebuilt network, she had just become, in Casimir's calculation, not a threat to be neutralized, but a location to be used. They had driven the king directly to her, into a position where whatever happened next could be shaped into the story Casimir needed. A king who had abandoned his pack to chase a disgraced Luna. A king who had compromised his throne for a woman who had fled rather than faced judgment. The trap was not for her. It had never been for her. It was for Kaelin. And she was the bait. And she had signed a treaty and distributed it to 7 locations and planted his arrival here into the public record of 3 allied territories before she had understood any of this. She had built the cage without knowing she was building it, and Kaelin had walked into it because Aldrich had handed him the door. She looked at the king standing in her hall, tired, stripped of his usual political armor, in the one place in the world where he had no institutional power, with the full knowledge of what she had just told him, and the full weight of what he had just understood rearranging itself behind his eyes. And she understood that the woman who had spent 8 years being careful, being patient, being strategic, being precisely the opposite of the person who could be maneuvered, had just been maneuvered. Not completely, not yet. But the next move was not the move she had planned, and the person she had to make it with was not the adversary she had prepared for, and was not the partner she had been careful not to assume he could be. She had about 36 hours before Casimir's next move landed, and she was going to have to decide right now whether 8 years of building her own authority ended here, with her handing it to a king who had let her walk away, or whether she was going to take everything she had built and everything she was and step into a fight that was larger than the one she had prepared for. Seraphine looked at Kaelin. "We need to talk," she said. "All the way through. Everything you know and everything I know. Tonight." He met her eyes, and in the specific quality of how he met them, direct, without deflection, with the look of a man who had stopped calculating the cost and started calculating the necessity, she saw the answer before he spoke it. "Then let's start," he said. They talked through the night. Not the way people talked when they were trying to be careful with each other. Not the managed diplomatic exchange of 2 political authorities negotiating terms. They talked the way people talked when the building was on fire, and the only thing left to do was figure out which walls were still standing. Seraphine spread every map she had on the table. Kaelin laid out the Silvercrest Council's internal structure, meeting by meeting, the decisions that had looked like his and which she could now identify, piece by piece, as having been shaped from outside. They cross-referenced dates. They traced the movement of information. They built, over the course of 7 hours, an exact and comprehensive picture of what Casimir had built. It was a remarkable piece of work, in the cold, specific way that a well-constructed trap was remarkable. 8 years of patience. 8 years of managing which information reached the king and in what form, of positioning council members, of running the eastern border conflicts at exactly the temperature required to keep Silvercrest extended without decisive victory, of building toward the moment when a marriage alliance could be presented not as a power grab, but as a rescue. Casimir had not just planned to remove Seraphine. He had planned to replace her, functionally, institutionally, with a structure that he controlled entirely, so that the thing that had made her dangerous, her independence, her direct relationships with border territories, her authority that existed outside his management, could never regenerate. He had very nearly succeeded. "He'll move on the council within the week," Kaelin said. It was past midnight. A lamp burned low on the table, and the maps were covered in Seraphine's notations, her precise handwriting overlaying his verbal account with the structural clarity of someone who thought in systems. "The marriage proposal is already approved in principle. My absence gives him the precedent to begin formalizing it without my direct sanction. He'll argue urgency, the war, the political necessity of the alliance." "And your guard here," Seraphine said. 6 men. Can you reach Silver Crest before he moves?" Not in time to stop him through formal channels. He was looking at the map, at the distance between the borderlands and Silver Crest, his face carrying the specific exhaustion of a man working through arithmetic with a bad answer. "If I ride back tomorrow, I arrive in 4 days at the fastest. He needs 3. So formal channels are finished." "Yes." She looked at the map. Then she looked at him. "What does he need to formalize the marriage alliance without you?" "Council majority. He has it." "What does he need to make it stick politically across the pack?" Kaelin's jaw was tight. "Acceptance from the border alphas, the pack's senior territorial authorities." "And where are those alphas' loyalties right now?" He looked at her. She waited. "Mixed," he said slowly. "The Eastern alphas lean toward the Duskmere alliance because the war has made them want resolution at any cost. The Northern and Western alphas are more traditional. They'll want the king's direct sanction. And if the Queen of the Borderlands, who has active treaty relationships with 3 of those Northern alphas, sent a dispatch tonight, not tomorrow, tonight, calling for an emergency council of territorial alphas on the grounds of political corruption threatening the stability of the continent." Kaelin went very still. "That's a significant claim," he said. "I have 8 years of documentation," she said. "I have the testimony of what I heard in that corridor. I have the intercepted dispatch from this settlement that shows Casimir had an operative positioned here. Timeline, methodology, the key to my desk drawer. I have the pattern of the eastern border conflicts cross-referenced against the council decisions that shaped Silvercrest's response. And I have Tetch." She paused. "If Tetch broke far enough to send me that letter, he'll testify. He knows where everybody is buried. Casimir will say it's a disgraced Luna attempting to manipulate pack politics from exile. Then the disgraced Luna will stand in front of every alpha on this continent with her documentation and her witnesses and her treaty and the Alpha King of Silver Crest standing beside her, and Casimir can make that argument directly to all of them." She looked at him steadily. "He spent 8 years building a picture of me. I spent 8 years building a position. We find out which one is sturdier." Kaelin was quiet for a long moment. The lamp between them was burning very low, and in the light it cast, his face looked like the face she remembered. Not the eroded version she had seen riding up the South Road, but the version underneath that. The one that had made decisions that cost him something, and had made them anyway. "You'd be exposing everything," he said. "Your children, your history, the full account of why you left." "I'm already exposed," she said. "Casimir's operative was here for months. Whatever he gathered, it's already in Casimir's hands. The only question is whether I let him use it to define me, or I define it myself." She paused. "I've been waiting 8 years for the moment, when I had enough to stand on. I have it. If I wait for a safer moment, there won't be one. There never was going to be one. I think I knew that." He looked at her for a long time. The silence between them was different from the silence at the beginning of the night. Less distance, more weight, the kind of quiet that accumulated between people who had been working toward the same understanding from opposite directions and had just arrived at the same place. "The dispatches go tonight," he said. "I'll add my seal." "Your seal matters," she said. "This works with your seal in a way it doesn't without it." "I know." He looked at the maps. "Seraphine." She looked up. "I let you go," he said. "I've said it once. I want to say it again because I want you to hear it clearly, not as a justification for anything that comes next. I let you go. I chose a convenient story over the person who should have been unchallengeable in my trust, and everything that followed from that. The 8 years, what you built alone, the children. That's on me. All of it. The lamp flame moved. She looked at him and let the words land without deflecting them or diminishing them, which was harder than she had expected. I hear you, she said. It was not forgiveness. He knew it wasn't, and the fact that he didn't reach for more than she was giving told her something about who he had become in 8 years that was different from who he had been. Grief did that sometimes. Managed right, and most people didn't manage it right. But sometimes, it built something where it had torn something down. The dispatches, she said. They worked until 4 in the morning. Well, so the riders went out before dawn. 12 of them, a combination of her fastest people and 2 of Kaylin's personal guard, going to 12 different locations by 12 different routes with sealed documents carrying both their authorities, requesting immediate assembly of the Continental Alphas at a neutral site that Seraphine had identified 18 months ago as the one location on the continent that no single pack claimed and that every pack had historical access to. A place called the Greystone Flats, 4 days' ride south of Silvercrest. They had 4 days before Casimir could finalize the marriage proposal. 4 days before the window closed. It was enough, or it wasn't, and there was nothing more to do about it now, except everything else. Beats. Kaylin met his children in the morning. Seraphine stood at the far end of the yard and watched, because this was not a moment she needed to manage and because some things needed space rather than structure. She watched Kaylin crouch down to meet them at eye level, which he did without hesitation, and she watched Kaylin look at him with the direct, appraising stare of a child who had been told hard truths and was now taking his own measurements, and she watched Lyra put out her hand in a formal greeting that was so precisely the gesture of someone who had decided exactly how to calibrate this first meeting, that Seraphine felt a surge of something in her chest that was equal parts pride and pain. She could not hear what was said. She watched Kaylin's face instead, and she watched the thing that happened to it. Not performance, not the managed emotion of a man constructing a response, but the actual thing, the undefended face of a person confronted with something that made the past 8 years fully and physically real in a way that no account or documentation could achieve. After a while, Kaylin said something that made Kaylin go very still. Then Kaylin said something back, and Kaylin thought about it, and then apparently found it acceptable, because he turned and pointed at something near the apple tree with the proprietary confidence of a person showing someone else his territory. They spent 40 minutes in the yard. When they came in, Kaylin found Seraphine in the hall and said, matter-of-factly, he apologized. I told him it was going to take more than that. He paused. He said he knew. I think he actually meant it. I think he did too, Seraphine said. Lyra cried a little, but she didn't want him to see. I know. I didn't cry. I know. Kaylin looked at her with the silver eyes that were so precisely the combination of both of them that it still sometimes stopped her. Are you going to be okay? She looked at her son, 7 years old, almost 8, already asking the question that adults forgot to ask each other because they assumed the answer. Yes, she said, I'm going to be fine. He went to find Lyra, and Seraphine stood in the quiet hall for one moment by herself. And she let herself feel the full weight of the night and the morning, and then she put it somewhere she could carry it without it slowing her down, and she went back to work. On the second day, Casimir's move came early. It came not as a formal council action, but as something more immediately dangerous. A force. 40 riders coming from the northeast, carrying Silvercrest colors and under the command of Captain Edron Tull, who was Casimir's man absolutely and had been for a decade, and who arrived at the outer boundary of the borderland settlement with a document bearing the Silvercrest Council seal and the authority of a majority council order demanding the immediate return of the Alpha King to Silvercrest pending urgent state business, and the simultaneous detainment, the document used the word detainment, of the former Luna Seraphine Ashmore pending investigation into charges of seal theft, territorial manipulation, and deliberate interference in pack political processes. Seraphine read the document standing at the gate with Dressed beside her, who had arrived the previous evening in response to her dispatch, and who read over her shoulder with the specific quality of stillness, that characterized a man deciding what kind of situation he had ridden into. Council Majority Seal, Drest said. Yes. King Seal is absent. Yes. That's an interesting omission, isn't it? Toll sat his horse 10 yards back from the gate with the contained authority of a man who had been given specific instructions and intended to execute them, and who had done the calculation that 40 armed riders versus a settlement's border guard was a straightforward outcome. He was not wrong about the numbers. He was wrong about what the numbers meant, which was a mistake that men who thought in terms of force tended to make. Seraphine walked to the gate and opened it herself and stepped through, which was not what Toll had expected, because the expected response was negotiation from behind the wall, and this was something else. She stopped in front of his horse. She was carrying nothing. She looked up at him with the same expression she used when she sat down across from hostile representatives at a treaty table. Not aggressive, not deferential, the expression of a person who had already worked out how this was going to go and was giving the other party the courtesy of the opening. Captain Tull, she said, former Luna. His voice was flat, professional. The document you're carrying is signed by a council majority without the Alpha King's seal. Under Silver Crest's own pack charter, a detainment order against a territorial authority requires the king's direct sanction. I know that charter. I spent 4 years administering it. She held his gaze. The Alpha King is present in this territory. You can ask him directly whether he sanctions this order. A beat. My instructions come from Casimir Vorn, through a council majority that he has shaped over 8 years through deliberate manipulation of the king's information and strategic management of pack politics. I can document every step of that process. She kept her voice level and her eyes on his face. You're a working man, Captain. You follow orders because orders come from legitimate authority. I'm asking you to consider whether the authority behind this specific order is what it appears to be. That's not defiance. That's due diligence. Toll looked at her for a long moment. She watched him work through it. Not the political calculation, he wasn't built for that, but the simpler soldier's calculation of legitimate command and what happened to a man who followed an order that later turned out to be illegitimate. That calculation had a very specific answer, and Toll was experienced enough to know it. I'll need to hear from the king directly, he said finally. I'll get him, she said. She turned and walked back through the gate without hurrying. Kalen was already in the yard. He had heard, sound carried cleanly in the still morning air, and he was standing just inside the gate with his face wearing the expression it wore when he had decided something and the decision was final, and anything that followed was just execution. I heard, he said. Toll's not the problem. He'll stand down if you confirm the order is unauthorized. And then he rides back to Casimir and tells him I'm here and aware and aligned with you. He was going to do that regardless. She looked at him. Does it change your position? No. He walked through the gate. She watched him cross to Toll, watched the exchange, short, definitive, the king's voice carrying the register it carried when it was not requesting but stating, and watched Toll's posture go through a visible recalibration before he gave the order that turned his 40 riders around. They rode northeast. Kalen came back through the gate. He didn't speak immediately. Drest was watching him with the expression of a man updating his assessment of a situation in real time. He'll send a larger force, Kalen said. Yes. How long do we have before the Alphas arrive? 2 days, Seraphine said. If all 12 dispatches were received and every Alpha rides immediately. And if they don't? She looked at him. Then we fight with what we have. Drest said, What is what we have, exactly? The border guard, my combined force, roughly 160 fighters. Your Ironfall riders if you commit them. Petra's people if she commits. The Ashvale delegation has 20 trained guards. She looked at Drest steadily. And the Alpha King of Silver Crest, which changes the strategic picture in ways that numbers don't capture. Drest looked at Kalen. The look of one Alpha measuring another. Not hostile, specific. Then he looked at Seraphine. You trust him. I trust that our interests are aligned, she said. Right now, that's enough. Drest considered this. I'll commit the Ironfall riders. Thank you. He walked off toward the stables, and Seraphine turned to find Kaylin looking at her with the expression she had seen in the council room the night before, the direct, undeflecting look of a man who had stopped calculating the cost. "You didn't say yes," he said. "To what?" "When Drest asked if you trusted me. You didn't say yes." She looked at him. "Aligned interests are real," she said. "Trust is something that gets built. I'm not going to tell you what you want to hear when there's actual work to be done." Something moved in his eyes. Not hurt. Something more complicated. Something that had the texture of a man encountering something he recognized as right, even when it cost him. "Fair," he said. "Good. Come look at the defensive positions. If Casimir sends a second force, they won't wait for a gate." The second force arrived the next morning before dawn. Not 40, 120, and these were not Captain Tull's professional soldiers with a legal document and a clear chain of command. These were the kind of force that moved in the dark without announcement. A strike team, organized with the specific efficiency of a man who had run out of subtler options and was now using the only lever left. Seraphine was awake when the outer scout sent the signal. She had slept 3 hours. It was enough. She had learned in the long years of building that enough was a decision as much as a condition, a choice to treat what you had as sufficient and move with it, because waiting for better conditions was a luxury that circumstances did not routinely offer. She pulled on her boots and her coat and strapped the iron dagger to her left forearm, which was where she wore it when she meant it, and she walked out into the pre-dawn dark. The settlement's combined force had been positioned the night before, every approach covered. The eastern fence line reinforced, Drest's Ironfall riders placed at the northern approach where the tree cover was thinnest, and a mounted force could be met with mounted force, rather than defenders against cavalry in open ground. Petra's 20 guards at the southern gate, her own border fighters on the walls. Kaylin found her at the main gate. He was armed. The sword at his hip was not ceremonial. It was a working blade, worn at the grip and balanced for actual use. The sword of a man who had not always been a king and who had not forgotten what he was before. He looked at her in the pre-dawn dark, and what passed between them was not a plan or a declaration. It was the specific wordless exchange of two people who were about to do something dangerous and who had, in the past 48 hours, arrived at a place where they could trust the other's judgment without requiring its explanation. She said, "Casimir won't be with them." "No, he doesn't fight. He sends." Which means whoever is commanding this force has orders but not authority to negotiate. They're here to take us, not to engage. So we don't give them the conditions for a clean grab. He looked at the gate. "We make this expensive enough that they have to report back before they escalate." "Agreed." She looked at him. "Stay visible. Your presence is the complicating factor they weren't briefed on. Let them see you." "Seraphine," she looked up. "Where are the children?" "East building. Mara is with them. The east building has the stone walls and the route to the back passage." She held his gaze. "They're safe." "If this goes wrong, it won't go wrong," she said. "And if it does, the copies of the treaty and the documentation are in 7 locations that Casimir doesn't know about. The work survives even if we don't. That's why I distributed them." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read in the dark. Then he said, 8 years ago, if you had told me what you were going to build, it wouldn't have mattered what you said," she said. "I had to build it to know I could." The signal came from the North Watch. They moved. The next 40 minutes were the kind of controlled chaos that looked like disorder from inside and like inevitability in retrospect. The attacking force hit the northern approach first. The feint, as she had predicted, designed to draw the mounted defense away from the main gate. Dressed riders held their position and did not pursue, which cost them in the opening moments but preserved the formation. The actual assault came at the eastern fence line, 30 riders moving fast and low with the specific coordination of people who had rehearsed this approach. They hit the reinforced fence and found it reinforced. She fought alongside her border guard, not from behind, not at a distance, because a leader who sent other people into danger she wasn't willing to share was a kind of leader that people followed until they didn't, and she had built something here that was worth standing in front of. The iron dagger was for close work. She was not graceful with it and didn't pretend to be. She was effective with it, which was the only thing that mattered. Kaelin fought on the wall above the eastern gate, visible in the torchlight, and the visibility was strategic. Every attacker who looked up and recognized the Alpha King of Silvercrest holding the wall against a force carrying Silvercrest colors was an attacker who had to update his calculation of what exactly he was doing and who had authorized it and whether the answer to those questions was going to end well for him. 3 of the attacking riders broke off within 20 minutes, then 2 more. The coherence of the assault was eroding not from force, but from the specific failure of morale that occurred when soldiers realized they were attacking their own king. Then the arrow came from the eastern tree line, not a combat arrow, aimed and fired in the chaos of engagement, but a single shot from a position outside the perimeter, elevated, targeted. It hit Kaelin in the left shoulder. She heard him. Not a sound of pain, a short, controlled exhale, the sound of a man absorbing impact and immediately assessing the damage. She was 30 feet away on the wall, and she covered the distance in seconds, and she got her hand on his arm and looked at the shaft. Clean entry, left shoulder, high, not the chest, not the throat. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw the exact same assessment. Not fear, the fast, cold calculation of a person determining whether they were still functional. "I'm standing," he said. "I see that. Don't stop the line." "I'm not stopping the line." She kept her hand on his arm and looked out at the fight and called the positioning adjustment that the gap in the wall had created, her voice carrying clean over the noise, and the line held. The attacking force broke at the 40-minute mark. Not routed, not destroyed, but cracked, the coherence gone, the riders pulling back into the tree line with the disorganized withdrawal of people who had lost the thread of why they were there. The settlement held. She helped Kaelin off the wall. He was still upright and still functional and still arguing about both of those facts being more than sufficient, which she ignored because the arrow was still in his shoulder, and that was not a thing that could be argued into being fine. Mara appeared from the east building. She had been monitoring the perimeter from a position where she could watch both the fight and the door, because Mara was always exactly where she needed to be. And she took one look at the arrow and said, "Inside, now." "The perimeter," Kaelin said. "Dressed has the perimeter," Seraphine said. "Inside." He went inside. Mara worked fast and without ceremony, and Kaelin bore it without complaint, which told Seraphine something about the version of himself he was in right now. Not the proud man, not the king managing appearances, but the person underneath all of that, the one she had seen glimpses of years ago and had been seeing clearly for the past 2 days. The arrow came out clean. The wound was bad, but not catastrophic. Mara packed and bound it with the competence of someone who had done this before, more than once, in more difficult conditions. Kaelin was in the doorway. He had stayed, she had told him to stay, and he had stayed, which had cost him considerably, and which he was clearly not planning to do again without discussion. He looked at his father's bound shoulder and then at Seraphine with the expression of someone who had a great deal to say and was exercising enormous restraint. "Tomorrow," she said. "We'll talk tomorrow." Then her lead scout came through the door, mud on his boots and something in his face that she read immediately as news she needed. "Riders on the South Road," he said. 12 groups, coming from every direction. They're carrying mixed colors. Ironfall, Ashvale, Crestfall, 4 others I didn't recognize. The Alphas. They had come. She stood in the room with her arrow-wounded king and her son in the doorway, and Mara's hand still busy at the bandage, and the news that the 12 dispatches had reached 12 destinations and 12 Alphas had ridden toward a neutral account of what had been done to this continent. And she felt the entire weight of 8 years converge into this single day, this single hour, this single room. "How long?" she said. 4 hours, maybe less. She looked at Kaelin. He looked back at her from under Mara's hands, pale and sharp-eyed and fully present, and she saw in his face the same thing she felt in her chest, that they had arrived, both of them, at the point past which nothing could be taken back or undone. The point where the only direction was forward into the full truth of everything they had built, and everything they had lost, and everything they had not yet decided about each other. "Can you stand before the Alphas in 4 hours?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "Can you?" She picked up the iron dagger from the table where she had set it when she came inside, and she cleaned it and she strapped it back to her forearm. "I've been standing before harder things than this for 8 years," she said. Kalen Draven looked at his mate. The word came to him not as a legal designation or a political category, but as a simple and undeniable fact, the way gravity was a fact, the way the wound in his shoulder was a fact, and he understood, fully and without the buffer of pride, that the woman in front of him had not survived what she had survived by luck or circumstance. She had survived because she was, and had always been, exactly what he had failed to see clearly until she was gone. The South Road was full of riders carrying the colors of every territory on the continent, coming toward a reckoning that Casimir Vorn had not planned for, and there were 4 hours left before everything became irreversible. 4 hours. She walked to the door. "Then let's get ready," she said. The Alphas arrived in the early afternoon light, 12 of them, from 12 directions, with their senior advisors and their guards, and the particular guarded energy of territorial leaders who had ridden hard on short notice in response to a document that promised them a reckoning and had delivered, instead of the quiet diplomatic assembly they had expected, a settlement that smelled of smoke and showed the fresh scarring of a fight along its eastern fence line. Seraphine met them at the gate. She had washed the fight off her face and changed her coat and strapped the iron dagger where it always went, and she stood at the gate the way she had learned to stand at the beginning of difficult negotiations. Grounded, forward, not performing steadiness, but actually steady, because the difference between those two things was visible to anyone who had spent enough time in rooms where something real was at stake. Kalen stood beside her. His shoulder was bound and his color was not good, and he was upright and present with the look of a man who had made a decision about what his body's complaints were worth attending to right now, which was nothing. She had not asked him to stand with her. He had simply been there when she walked to the gate, which was, she thought, its own kind of statement. Not about politics or alliance, but about a choice he had made without needing to announce it. Dressed was the first through the gate, because Dressed had been here already, and because Dressed, in a room full of alphas, moved like a man who understood the value of arriving before the situation solidified. The others came in behind him, and Seraphine watched their faces as they processed what they were looking at. The settlement, the reinforced fence, the guard rotation, the evidence of the night's engagement, and then the two figures at the gate, and then the specific fact of what those two figures standing together meant in the political language they all spoke. No one spoke for a moment. Then the alpha from Crestfall, a woman named Halvin, gray-haired and compact, who had not been among Seraphine's allied territories, and who had ridden 4 days to be here in response to a document she had no prior relationship with, looked at Kalen directly and said, "You're wounded." "It'll keep," Kalen said. "It'll keep," Halvin repeated with the tone of someone filing this information in a specific category. "You were attacked on your own Luna's territory by a force carrying Silver Crest colors." "Yes." "Under a council order without your seal." "Yes." Halvin looked at Seraphine, the look of a woman taking a measurement. "You're the one who built this." "Yes." "Show us," Halvin said. "All of it." Tamat. The assembly ran for 3 hours. Seraphine presented it the way she had built it, systematically, without embellishment, starting with what she had heard in the corridor and moving through 8 years of documentation with the precision of someone who had known from the beginning that this moment would come, and that when it did, the work would need to speak for itself. She showed them the pattern of the eastern border conflicts and their correlation to Silvercrest Council decisions. She showed them the timeline of Casimir's influence over the king's information. She showed them the evidence of the operative planted in the borderland settlement and the intercepted dispatch. She showed them the marriage proposal and its council approval and the absence of the king's seal on the detainment order. She showed them Elder Tetch's letter. And then, because she had sent for him the night before using a route that Casimir did not control, she had Tetch himself. Arrived an hour before the assembly, old and diminished and carrying the specific exhaustion of a man who had been preparing himself for a confession for a very long time. Stand before the assembled alphas and speak. Tetch spoke for 40 minutes. He spoke with the thorough, dismantling clarity of a man who had decided that the only thing left worth doing was the truth, and he told it without softening. He named every decision that had been shaped, every report that had been filtered, every border conflict that had been managed, every piece of information about Seraphine that had been withheld from the king or reframed before delivery. He named Aldrich Morn's role specifically, and with dates. When he finished, the assembly room was very quiet. Halvin said, to no one in particular, 8 years. No one answered her because the answer was obvious, and the obvious things were the ones that landed hardest. Kalen had not spoken during the presentation. He sat at the table with his bound shoulder and his controlled face, and he listened to every word with the stillness of a man who was not managing his reaction, but was genuinely, fully absorbing it. Feeling the weight of each piece as it was placed, not performing the role of a king receiving evidence, but actually understanding what he was being told, and what it meant about the years he had lived through, thinking they were something else. When Tetch finished, Kalen said, Casimir Vorn is to be held for formal council judgment. His authority is suspended pending a full accounting. He looked at the assembled alphas. I'm asking for your witness to that declaration, not your approval, your witness. One by one, around the table, 12 alphas inclined their heads. Dressed was last. He looked at Kalen for a moment with the expression of a man completing a long assessment. Then he inclined his head. Witnessed, he said. Casimir Vorn was taken into custody 2 days later at Silvercrest by a guard detail carrying both the council's formal authority and the Alpha King's direct seal. Aldrich Morn surrendered without resistance, which surprised people who hadn't known him and surprised no one who had. Rowan Tetch's formal testimony was already entered into the pack's legal record before either of them was brought in. Seraphine was not there for the arrests. She stayed in the borderlands and ran her territory and let the machinery of Silvercrest justice operate without her presence in it, because her presence would have made it about her, and it wasn't about her. It was about the work, the documentation, the 8-year record of what had been done and what it had cost, and that record was strong enough to stand without her standing next to it. She heard the outcome through a dispatch 3 weeks later, written in Tetch's careful hand. The charges were confirmed. The sentences were formal exile, permanent removal from Silvercrest territory, and from any position of authority within the pack's political structure. The marriage proposal was rescinded. The council was dissolved and reconvened with a new majority drawn from territorial representatives rather than appointed advisors, which was the structural reform that Seraphine had written into her own treaty framework 2 years prior as the correction for exactly this class of failure. She read the dispatch sitting at the desk in the council room, alone, in the late afternoon. When she finished, she set it down and sat very still for a moment, and she felt the specific quality of an ending. Not triumphant, not relieved exactly, but the feeling of something that had been held under sustained tension for 8 years finally releasing, and the strange, almost disorienting lightness of a weight she had been carrying so long she had stopped feeling it as separate from herself. She sat with it for a while. She let it be what it was. Kalen came back to the borderlands 10 days after the arrests. He came alone this time, without the 6-man guard, which was either trust or the decision that the political context had changed enough that the gesture of arriving alone meant something different than it had before. He arrived in the late afternoon and he didn't come to the main hall. He came to the East Yard where he had spent 40 minutes with his children 2 weeks before, and he sat down on the fence rail near the apple tree and waited. Seraphine found him there when she came out of the evening's last council review. She walked across the yard and stopped a few feet from him, and they looked at each other in the light that was going amber and flat over the ridgeline. He looked better than he had. The shoulder was healing. The eroded quality that she had seen in him riding up the South Road had shifted into something different. Not easier, not lighter in the casual sense, but cleaner. The look of a man who had been carrying a wrong understanding for 8 years and had finally put it down and replaced it with the actual weight of what had happened, which was heavier in some ways and lighter in others, and which was, at minimum, real. The council reform passed, he said. I know, Tetch wrote. The framework you built, the territorial representation model, I want to use it for Silvercrest. It'll need adaptation, she said. The pack structure is different from what I was working with here. I know, I was hoping you'd help adapt it. She looked at him. I'm not asking you to come back, he said. And the careful precision of that sentence, the exact thing he was and wasn't saying, told her he had worked on it. I'm not asking for anything that we haven't built toward honestly. I'm asking if you'd be willing to work on it. The reform. With me. She was quiet for a moment. Around them, the settlement moved through its evening. The ordinary sounds of a place that worked, that had been built by people who showed up every day and did the things that needed doing, and that was still here because of 40 minutes of holding a fence line and 12 alphas who had ridden hard and a king who had sat still and listened for 3 hours without defending himself. You said the reform passed, she said. Majority, not unanimously. Who voted against? 3 holdovers from the old council. They'll be replaced in the next cycle. He paused. I need someone who understands the structural principles behind what you built. I need someone who can look at the things I can't see clearly because I'm inside them. He looked at her steadily. I need you. You needed me 8 years ago, she said. Not with cruelty, with the flatness of a thing that was true and needed saying. Yes, he said. I did, and I chose pride over judgment, and the 8 years are on me, and I'm not asking you to pretend otherwise. He held her gaze. I'm asking what we do from here. She looked at him, at the specific face of a person who had been through the thing that destroyed most people's capacity to be honest with themselves, the thing that required them to believe they had been right because the alternative was too costly, and who had instead done the harder thing, which was to look at it directly and take the full weight of it and keep standing. She thought about Kaylin, asking her if she still loved him, and her own answer, I don't know yet. I think I need to see him first. She had seen him now. She had seen him in the council room listening to Tetch's testimony without flinching. She had seen him on the wall with an arrow in his shoulder, still calling the defensive line. She had seen him crouch down to his children's eye level without hesitation, and accept Kaylin's terms without arguing them. She had seen him stand beside her at the gate and present himself to 12 alphas, not as the alpha king requiring deference, but as a man who had made serious errors and was accounting for them. She did not know if that was love. She knew it was something she had not expected to find in him, and she knew it was real. And she knew that real things were worth more than she had let herself believe anything was worth for 8 years, because letting herself believe in things had felt too dangerous for a very long time. The adaptation work, she said. It'll take months, possibly a year. I know. I'm not leaving the borderlands. This territory needs the continuity of its founding authority through the transition to the new governance structure. I can't walk away from that. I'm not asking you to. Which means the work would happen here and in Silvercrest both, over time, with significant correspondence and regular... She stopped. She looked at him. This isn't about the reform. No, he said. It isn't. She exhaled. Not quite a laugh. Something that had been held too long and needed to come out. Something that was the release of 8 years of precision and control, and the choice to feel nothing she couldn't afford to feel, arriving at a moment where she could afford to feel things again, and finding that the things were still there, intact, underneath all the years of careful management. I'm not forgiving you tonight, she said. I know. That's not a process I can do on a schedule. It takes as long as it takes. I know that too. And the children, whatever happens between us doesn't override their right to know their father independently of it. If they decide they want that relationship, it belongs to them, not to whatever we are or aren't. Agreed, he said without hesitation, and the speed of the agreement told her it was not a concession, but a position he had already arrived at on his own. She looked at him for a long moment in the amber light. Come to dinner, she said. Mara cooks on Tuesdays. She'll have made too much. He got off the fence rail. He stood in the yard in the evening light, and he looked at her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. And it was the first silence in 2 weeks that had no weight in it except the weight of 2 people standing in the same place at the same time, which was, for all the years and all the damage and all the building, where they had always been heading. 3 months later, the formal assembly convened at Greystone Flats. Every alpha on the continent was present. The treaty that Seraphine had built and the governance reforms that she and Kaylin had spent 3 months adapting for the full scope of the pact system were presented together as a unified framework under both their authorities. The debate took 2 days. Some of the older alphas argued about sovereignty. Some of them argued about precedent. Halvin, who had ridden 4 days on short notice because a document had arrived that promised a reckoning, argued for the framework with the direct, unadorned language of a woman who had watched pack politics destroy 3 territorial arrangements in her lifetime, and who wanted something that worked. On the morning of the 3rd day, the treaty was ratified. Seraphine stood at the Greystone Flats assembly table in the clear autumn light, and she signed her name to the founding document of the United Wolf Territories, and she signed it as Queen, not because a title was what she had wanted, but because the title was what the framework required, a specific authority with a specific accountability, and she was done being ambiguous about what she was and what she had built. Kaelin signed beside her as Alpha King of Silver Crest, a signatory nation of the new Union rather than its governing authority, which was not a reduction, but a clarification, and which he signed without hesitation. Kaelin and Lyra stood behind them. She had not arranged for them to be there as a statement. They were there because they had asked to come, and she had said yes, because they were the people this was for, not in the sentimental sense, not as symbols, but in the specific sense that the framework she had built was built toward a future that would belong to people who weren't yet old enough to have made the choices that had shaped this one, and they deserved to see it made. Kaelin watched the signing with the focused attention of someone memorizing something. Lyra watched it with the still, comprehensive observation she brought to everything, already filing away what the signatures looked like and what order they went in, and what the faces of the alphas looked like when they signed. After it was done, after the seal was set and the document made official, and the assembly began the long procedural work of establishing what came next, Seraphine stepped back from the table, and she stood for a moment with the morning air on her face and the sound of 12 territorial authorities beginning to build something together for the first time in a history that had been defined by everything but cooperation. Mara appeared beside her, because Mara always appeared where she was needed. She handed Seraphine a cup of water and said nothing, which was exactly right. Seraphine drank the water. She looked out over the Greystone Flats, at the gathered alphas and their advisors, and the flags of 12 territories and her own children standing in the clear autumn light. She thought about the storeroom, the dark, and the smell of old linen, and the 4 minutes of counting her heartbeats before she moved. The thing she had decided in that room, which was not a plan and not a strategy, but a simpler thing, that she was going to survive this, and that surviving this was going to be the beginning rather than the end, and that the woman who came out the other side of it was going to be worth the cost of becoming her. She had not known, in that storeroom, what the cost would be. She had not known about the 11-day pass, or the graywash settlement, or the 8 years alone, or the 40 minutes on the fence line, or the 3-hour assembly with 12 alphas that turned the whole continent. She had not known about her children's faces or about Kaelin sitting still on a fence rail in the amber light and asking her what they did from here. She had only known that she was not willing to be small, that she was not willing to be a story that someone else told about her, that the truth of what she was and what she was capable of was worth fighting for even when the fight required her to disappear in order to win it. Kaelin came to stand beside her. He did not take her hand. They were still, carefully and honestly, in the process of building something rather than assuming it. But he stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the realness of another person after years of operating alone. And it was not diminishment. It was addition. "How does it feel?" he said. She considered the question seriously, which was the only way she knew how to consider anything. "Like the beginning of the actual work," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the particular honesty of a man who had relearned what honesty cost and had decided it was worth it. "I would have missed all of it. If I hadn't—" He stopped, started again. "I would have spent the rest of my life in a palace that Casimir built around me thinking it was my own." "Yes," she said. "That doesn't make what I did acceptable." "No," she said. "It doesn't. But it makes it something you understand now, which is more than most people manage with the mistakes they make." He looked at her. "You're extraordinarily hard on people." "I'm accurate," she said. "There's a difference." Something moved in his face, the thing that had become familiar over the past months, the thing that was not quite a smile but was in the same territory. The expression of a man who had stopped finding her standards inconvenient and had started finding them the thing he oriented by. Kalen appeared between them, with the physical confidence of a child who understood that the space between his parents was a space he had a right to occupy. He looked up at Seraphine and then at Kalen with the direct, measuring gaze that had not changed since the day he was born. "Is it done?" he said. "The signing is done," Seraphine said. "The work is just starting." He thought about this with the gravity it deserved. Then he said, "Good. I want to learn how the council system works. The representation model. Can someone explain it to me?" Kalen looked down at his son, the silver eyes and the set jaw and the complete uncalculating directness of a child who had been raised without the instinct to make himself smaller than he was. And Seraphine watched something move across his face that was too full to name and that she didn't try to name. "I can explain it," Kalen said. "Okay," Kalen said. And then, because he was Kalen, absolutely and without revision, "You should probably sit down. Your shoulder still looks bad." Kalen sat down. Lyra came to stand beside Seraphine, and she slipped her hand into her mother's without looking up, watching her father explain the council system to her brother with the patient specificity of a man who had learned that the quality of his presence was the only repair available to him, which was, for now, enough. Seraphine stood on the gray stone flats in the clear autumn light with her daughter's hand in hers, and the treaty signed and the work beginning, and she thought that this was what survival actually looked like from the inside. Not triumphant, not resolved in the clean way that stories promised, but real. Complicated and earned and full of the specific weight of everything it had taken to get here, which was also the weight of everything it was worth. She held her daughter's hand. She watched her son learn something. She let the morning be what it was. The peace that settled across the territories in the months and years that followed was not the peace of absence, not the peace of things being resolved so completely that nothing remained to be done. It was the harder and more durable kind, the peace that came from building something together that no one person could dismantle alone, because the work of building it had required enough people making enough genuine commitments that the structure held even when individual pieces failed. That was the legacy. Not the signatures or the flags or the titles, though all of those things were real and necessary. The legacy was in the framework, in the principle, built into every article of the founding treaty, that authority without accountability was not authority but theater, and that the difference between a ruler and a servant was not the direction of the power, but the direction of the responsibility. Seraphine had not written that principle in order to leave a legacy. She had written it because it was true, and because the truth of it was the thing she had paid for with 8 years of her life and all of her solitude and the specific, uncountable cost of doing something hard entirely alone. It was worth it. Not because the cost was acceptable, it wasn't, and she would not pretend otherwise, but because some things needed to be built, and the people who could build them were not always the people in the positions that made building easy. And when you were the person who could do it, you did it with what you had and where you were, and you trusted that the work would outlast the difficulty. It did. Years later, when people told the story of how the United Wolf Territories came to be, they told it different ways in different places, as stories always were. Some versions started with the Alpha King, who learned humility. Some versions started with the conspiracy that nearly destroyed a continent's political order. Some versions started with the twins, Kalen and Lyra, who grew into exactly the kind of leaders that the New Age required. People who had been raised inside the work, who had watched their parents rebuild something that had been broken, who understood that authority was not inherited but demonstrated day after day in the choices you made when no one was watching. But the version that Mara told in the years when people came to the Greywash settlement to ask her what it had really been like was simpler than any of those. She came to the gate, Mara would say, with mud on her boots and a cut on her hand, and she said she could do the work. And then she did it. That was the whole story. Everything else was what the work looked like.